So welcome back to KTN News Center. So we had it from the CAS for Education, Zach Kinuthia, talking about very pertinent concerns that have been raised during this time, and especially the forecast today was on private schools. A low turnout. Some private schools have not opened because they do not have the capacity of reopening their schools due to the effects of COVID-19. And with me this morning, we are privileged to have the CEO of the Kenya Private Schools Association, Peter Ndoro, and also an education expert joining us is Mrs. Mutheu Kasanga. Just to delve in deeper into this conversation, I know we had from Kasanga earlier on before we brought in Mr. Ndoro, but then let me begin with Mr. Ndoro. Let me just give you a recap, Mr. Ndoro, of what the CIS has talked about. It's talked about low turnout in private schools due to COVID-19, the effects of COVID-19. He's also talked about about 52,000 children being traced, 52,000 learners from private schools being traced and being put in a learning institution so as to continue with their education. And he's also talked about parents being there just to ensure that the children go back to school. But what I need to pick your mind on is on that number of children who are affected, children who are learning in private schools who are affected by COVID-19 because their schools closed. Give us the figure, the correct figure of the children who've been traced so far. Is it 52,000 as been stated by the CAS, or the number might be less or higher than that?
Thank you very much, Brenda, and Happy New Year to you. First of all, I want to appreciate the reports that we have been getting from across the country, from our schools that opened on Monday, because we have received very, very impressive reports about the turnout of learners in those private schools. At this point in time, I want to mention that, yes, indeed, private schools were affected very much by COVID-19 in the year 2020, and some of them closed shop and are not to reopen again. But, Brenda, let me inform you that despite that particular challenge, the 56,000 learners that were in those schools that will not be able to reopen because of the challenges of COVID will be placed in other private schools, and some may choose to go to public schools. So the issue of these learners not getting an opportunity to go back to school should not actually arise, because all of them have actually been guided properly on what needs to be done. This is something that we picked last year around September, August, when there was pronouncement that we're going to have phased reopening. And we guided our schools very well to indicate and tell their parents that the schools will not be reopening again, and therefore they should be able to look for opportunities in other schools. We guided our private schools to also be on the lookout and call these parents and advise them that they have opportunities for them in those institutions. So that is not a challenge in terms of learners getting opportunities to continue with their education. But it is regrettable that we had to close 339 schools because of COVID-19.
And that's And you know, Mr. Ndoro, it's good you're saying that it's regrettable that these private schools had to be closed. Is it because the government failed to release the 7 billion shillings that they had promised private schools? And what was the reason for the failure by the government not to release these funds?
Thank you. I wouldn't say specifically that they closed because the government failed to release the 7 billion stimulus package, but I would say that that contributed significantly to some of them closing. Because one of the things that these private schools tried to do was to reach out to some commercial banks. And the credit facilities that they were getting from these commercial banks were very expensive. So if the stimulus package from government had come to private schools, it would have been great relief to these institutions. And some of these institutions would not have closed. But of course, we have other challenges that made these schools to close. For example, there are those schools that were on rental premises. There are those schools that had challenges even before COVID. And therefore, in the absence of school fees that was coming to school when the children were in school, then the schools had to close. Mm-hmm. But the promise by the government that they're going to give us the 7 billion is still there, because the government has indicated to us that at the moment they're facing financial challenges in terms of cash flow. Mm-hmm. And when that situation improves, they are going to support the private sector.
All right. All right, at least you've answered that question because you've answered it. I'd asked you the failure, the reason as to why the government has not released that fund, but it's good you've answered it. But just before I bring in Kasanga into this conversation, I'd like to know, kindly give us the correct figures of how many private schools have been closed, have not reopened, and probably might not reopen.
According to the figures that we had before reopening, that is around 30th of December, was that 339 private schools had closed and were not to reopen again. And these institutions had 56,000 learners with a staff population of about 1,200.
All right.
But what I would want to hasten to mention is that all these learners, the 56,000 of them, have already been guided on where they are supposed to be placed, either in private or public schools. A majority of them have elected to go to other private schools, and we are grateful for that. But the challenge we have is how do we ensure that none of our schools closes again because of financial challenges.
All right. And so, Kasanga, as I was listening to the CS talking in Mombasa, he was talking to my colleague, Tobias Chanji, he was talking about, the state of reopening in private schools, low turnout. Are we likely to see this low turnout to continue as we move on? Because you've heard it from Ms. Ndoro that some children have opted to go to other private schools, others have not opted to go to private schools, others have probably, their parents have decided to do homeschooling and not take their children back to school because of COVID.
Allow me just to pick up on your last point there, homeschooling, and just reassure the country here that this is a very small percentage of significantly more financially able parents who are opting for this option. And because the homeschooling itself has some challenges in alignment, we want to urge parents as they opt for homeschooling to be very clear on the progression of their children as they go ahead. We have had to rescue children in the past from who had been homeschooled because parents then realized that actually in progression you have to be assessed at various milestones. So we want to urge parents that this pandemic, they should not be afraid. We have partially reopened, and we have seen that the pandemic actually does not affect children. You saw in October, November, where incidences where the COVID broke out in schools, and one running theme was that these children did not show any symptoms of it at all. Mm-hmm. Our children are safe in schools. And this, I think, a lot of this homeschooling is fear-driven.
Right.
We are also got full protocols on how to handle kids with pre-existing conditions. And these are the kids who we are recommending, especially if they are on the list of pre-existing conditions that the Ministry of Health has identified, especially diabetes and severe asthma. Mild asthma they are managing quite well. We managed quite well in the two and a half months we were open. Mm-hmm. But with severe asthma, we want parents now to come and talk to us so that we can put together work packets, whatnot, to ensure the child is not left behind, that this does not become the halt for education for these children. Right. The rest of the world is managing, and a vaccine is coming. You had the CS for Health on Sunday talking about vaccination. Right. And these are some of the kids who will be prioritized when push comes to shove.
In fact, I was about to ask you, Kasanga, about this, the health status of some of the children who have reported, who've reported back to school. Because there's a story that was filed by my colleague yesterday, Manuel, talking about the status of some, children with medical conditions. Yet they are the vulnerable people within the education sector in schools. So how will their welfare be taken care of within the public and private sector in terms of the education sector, so as to ensure that they do not contract COVID-19, and if a case is reported, they're actually safe?
A significant number of children with pre-existing conditions are also have other special needs as well. And this is an area we have discussed with in huge detail with the Ministry of Education, so that we are all working together, because all the special needs kids and these kids with pre-existing conditions, we have to now work together to ensure that they are kept safe. Within these schools that cater for these specific types of children, we are strictly enforcing the protocols, very strictly. This is that everybody is in concurrence that schools should not be visited by outsiders during this period, so that we can also get an opportunity to settle down and make sure that we can run the whole school, especially these schools with kids with such pre-existing conditions, who also happen to be kids with special needs. This is the one area where we are not compromising at all with anybody. And the parents are in full concurrence that this is how these schools should be run, that we must protect and cocoon these children in these safety bubbles that we are going to create once we are fully open. All right,
so Ms. Ndoro, I know you'd agree with me that the cash crunch meant that some schools were unable to prepare the institutions in line with the Ministry of Education protocols when it comes to, protecting learners from contracting COVID-19. So what is the association doing, because you head the schools as the private sector, what is the association doing or planning to do to ensure that some of these schools that had closed due to lack of funds, when they reopen, they will adhere to the Ministry of Education and the Ministry of Health protocol?
Thank you very much, Brenda. The Kenya Private Schools Association embarked on a program of capacity building of all the stakeholders within private schools to ensure that when they reopen, they adhere to the protocols and the guidelines given to us by the Ministry of Education and the Ministry of Health. What we did was that we advised our schools, in accordance with the guidelines, to set up what we are calling the COVID-19 response committees that will be able to check on every particular detail that will add towards the COVID-19 management in our schools. So that is something that we embarked on as Kenya Private School Association. And we are happy at this point in time because the reports that we have gotten from across the country is that very many of our private schools have actually been able to put in place measures to contain COVID as per the guidelines. In terms of schools that had financial challenges and are unable to put in place these measures, we have talked to financial institutions, our partners, KCB, Equity Bank, and Family Bank, to be able to assist us and give very flexible credit facilities to these private institutions. So far, that negotiation has been progressing very well, and quite a number of our schools have been able to receive that kind of support. So at this point in time, we are not seeing any challenge in terms of our private schools being able to put in place the protocols that are required for safe reopening of our institutions.
All right, and Ms. Ndoro, you can agree with me that COVID-19 has had an adverse effect on parents. Some children are coming from homes whereby probably they might have a relative, a father or mother who contracted the virus or died due to COVID-19. But they're also having that psychological torture of having to accept the fact that they'll be relocating to another school because the school is being closed or the school has been closed. So talk to us about the psychological effects that it has had on children, learners, and probably the sort of counseling that the association is planning to give parents and also learners.
Brenda, it is indeed true that children are coming back to school from a very difficult background. Some of them, it is true, lost their parents, lost their loved ones. They are coming in under very new, totally different conditions. They are being told they should not play with one another, they should not touch, they should not hug, they should not do very many things. Private Schools Association embarked on a program of mental and psychosocial support for all our stakeholders. That is the teachers, a psychosocial and mental support program for the learners as well as the parents. So for this point, at this point in time, one of the things that we have advised our schools to do is to ensure as they admit the children in our schools safely, they should embark on a program of mental and psychosocial support. Because even the teachers that we have, they are coming in from a very difficult background. Some of them came in having lost their incomes, having had their incomes reduced, or having gone on unpaid leave, and therefore this has had a negative impact on them. Right. So as Kenya Private Schools Association, one of the programs that we are prioritizing is mental and psychosocial support for all our stakeholders that targets teachers, targets learners, as well as the parents.
All right. So, Kasanga, let's talk about the nightmare that some parents are having right now. And this nightmare has been occasioned by the decision by private schools management to stop the school transport. This is because of, they're saying the argument is based on the fact that they cannot adhere to the Ministry of Health protocol when it comes to transport public service vehicles and you know, the school buses are falling under that category. They're saying they cannot do so many trips because of the traffic jams in Nairobi County. So how should private schools actually address this? Because so many parents have been depending on the school transport.
In fact, on Sunday, we had a tripartite meeting with the Ministry of Transport, Ministry of Health, and the Ministry of Education, where we sort of isolated school buses away from PSVs, the Matatu sector. And the Ministry of Transport has allowed school buses to carry students at capacity so that we don't add the extra financial burden to parents or take away the service altogether. Students are safer in school buses compared to being in public transport. You're well aware, for instance, that on trains, everybody sits on a seat. There's no social distancing on trains. We are all well aware that in the morning rush hours, the matatus struggle to ferry people to and from work within the Ministry of Health protocols. So we have agreed that students are safest in school buses.
Right. And
the Ministry of Transport has agreed to exempt school buses, yellow buses, from the Matatu rules, because those students are the same ones that use each vehicle. We have been tied down to very strict hygiene and sanitization of the buses before each trip, and the students must be masked, and there must be hand sanitizer as the students enter each bus each morning. The bus assistants as well, the drivers and the bus assistants as well, have been tied down to very strict protocols, as they have to sometimes handle the younger children to help them on and off the buses as well.
All right. And as we wind up this,
so we will be able to relieve parents from that stress.
Yeah, and I mean, it was such a nightmare because some of them were just wondering how they were going to transport their children, to schools. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I have just 2 minutes remaining, so I'll give you a minute each. So let me begin with Mr. Ndoro. Your final remarks as you wind up this conversation, especially when it comes to those learners who've been affected and might end up not even getting spaces in private or public schools.
Mine would be to encourage the parents and all the learners across the country that as private schools, we have made all the arrangements necessary to ensure that our learners are safe when they are in school, and that we are going to provide them with a quality education in a safe environment, and that we are going to take care of any eventuality that is going to come according to the guidelines that have been given to us by the Ministry of Education.
Right.
And that no learner will miss an opportunity either in our private schools or in the public sector.
Right.
Our doors in the private sector are open, and anybody wishing to come to private schools, they're welcome.
All right.
Thank you.
Mrs. Kasanga, as you finish, talk to us about the committee, the COVID-19 committee that has been set up by private schools to handle COVID-19 cases that might be reported. We hope that no case will be reported.
So far, as was reported on Sunday, we have all consolidated our efforts into one reporting structure so that information is received at the national level with utmost speed. So we've already started reporting back every day by midday to the sub-county offices, both public and private. So we've consolidated all our efforts to ensure that information is transmitted immediately. And I want to thank the Ministry of Health, the Ministry of Education, the Ministry of Interior for supporting us to make sure that as a country, right now there's no public or private. Every child is Kenyan, and we are ready to reopen education. Children are safer in schools than they are in the communities. Right now, our main worry is community transmission of COVID, and we urge parents and communities, wear your mask, wash your hands.
Right.
That is where COVID is coming from. It is not coming from schools.
All right, such a strong message from both Mudhoka Sanga, an education expert, and also Peter Ndoro, the CEO of the Kenya Private Schools Association, talking to us about the welfare, the state of affairs in the private sector, private schools here in the country. Another commercial break. When I come back during the second hour, we shall be hearing from my colleague in Uasin Gishu County, Eldoret town, that is Elvis Kosgei, will be talking to us about also the status of private schools in that county.
One, two, three. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Go sawa?